Attention all passengers. Do you want a front row seat for the future of air travel? The Skift Idea Awards are back, and the Airlines and Airports category is where innovation takes flight. From next-gen passenger experiences to bold sustainability moves, we're celebrating the ideas transforming the future of aviation. Airline Weekly Lounge listeners get 50% off their first entry with the code AW50FORYOU. That's AW50FORYOU. Head to live.skift.com to start your submission today. Hello and welcome to the Airline Weekly Lounge. I'm your host Gordon Smith, and in this week's special episode, we're in conversation with Willie Walsh, Director General of IATA. Hi, thanks for joining me on the Airline Weekly Lounge. We have a special treat for you this week. Ahead of the IATA AGM in Delhi, we're sharing highlights from a recent one-on-one conversation I had with Willie Walsh. Easily one of the industry's most influential voices, he's known today as the Director General of the IATA trade body. But before that, he headed up Aer Lingus, British Airways, and ultimately IAG. From Trump and tariffs to airspace and oil prices, Willie shares candid insights on where the industry is heading and what he thinks it'll take to get there. Recorded on the sidelines of the Kappa Summit in Athens, held earlier this month, I started by asking Willie for his latest insights on the supply chain woes plaguing the industry and if ramped up defence spending could make current problems even worse.
I think the concerns around supply chain continue to be high on the agenda. And we've been doing quite a bit of work on it at IATA. We brought together in Geneva week before last a group of suppliers, the Tier 1 OEMs, airlines and others interested to see, could we get into a room and see where there are some simple things we could all do together or better understand what the challenges are. But I think there were a few things that came out of that, particularly around Tier 2 and 3 suppliers, which can be a big part of the problem. Everybody says it's the engine. But actually, we're seeing difficulties just about everywhere. So we've commissioned a report on it, which we'll release probably before the AGM. But it may be after the AGM. But this issue continues to frustrate and, I would say anger some airline CEOs who clearly, want to see the aircraft that they have acquired in service. And that figure, I gave you this morning, 1,100 aircraft under the age of 10 years grounded at the moment. There's always a number of aircraft that will be grounded, but that's the highest we've ever seen. Clearly, if there's increased demand for defence, it will involve pretty much the whole supply chain. And I think a lot of these Tier 3, Tier 2 suppliers supply to defence as well as commercial. So I think it is an issue that's worth taking into account.
Walsh recently described the political changes in the US as a wake-up call for Europe, particularly European lawmakers. I asked him for his assessment of how European aviation policies may need to evolve given the changing geopolitical landscape.
Before the Trump administration, we were highlighting the fact that the Draghi report had highlighted the need to focus on competitiveness. I thought the Draghi report was good. I thought it could have gone further, but I thought it was a very valuable report. But even then, that's to some degree been overtaken by what's happened with the policies of the Trump administration. So I think the days when Europe can be comfortable regulating within Europe and that this is the right thing to do, I think those days are numbered because, Europe is going to have to start looking at its competitiveness in the world. And, I think everybody will be looking around for new trade partners. And, what does this mean if the US is going to continue to have tariffs that make products being exported to the US uncompetitive? Everybody's going to look for new markets. And that means, you're going to have to become more competitive everywhere. So I think it's really a situation where I would like to see Europe acknowledge that when they're introducing regulation, which may make sense in the single market, to test whether that makes sense with Europe competing in the world. So one of the examples I use, carbon leakage, and you hear a number of the airlines talking about this because of the EU requirements on mandates for SAF. and that this may lead to carbon leakage. And the EU's solution tends to be, okay, if that makes European airlines uncompetitive, what we'll do is we'll force cost on non-European airlines. Yep. To me, that's madness. If you're uncompetitive, what you should be doing is looking at how can I become more competitive, not how can I force my competitors to be artificially uncompetitive, because that's not going to work. So I think rather than looking at carbon leakage as an opportunity to impose your ineffective regulation on others, you should be questioning whether you can better adjust your regulation to maintain your competitiveness. And that's what I would like to see change.
I was speaking to Willie just a few days after the 100-day mark of President Trump's second term. While appreciating the need for nuance, I asked Willie if he thought the first 100 days had been net negative or net positive for the airline industry.
It's an interesting one because, it's clearly impacting on some markets. So Canada, US is the one that I highlight where, without question, bookings in both directions have been negatively impacted, more on the Canada point of sale than on the US point of sale, but it's impacted on both. That's not something that we had anticipated. So, that's clearly a negative. The issue of tariffs is impacting on air freight, air cargo. Now, what we've seen there is it's actually promoted very strong growth in air cargo in the first quarter of this year. The expectation being that that's people getting in ahead of the introduction of tariffs. And it's clearly introduced uncertainty, and uncertainty is something that's probably never welcomed by anybody. I think there was always going to be uncertainty, so I don't think that's new. Maybe not on the cargo side. The elimination of de minimis has a big impact, but I think it was probably always going to be the case that you would see a trade issue between the US and China. That was inevitable.
Arguably that preceded Trump.
Yeah. It was just accelerated under Trump 2.0. So, if you were to say, I think we're going to look at it just on 100 days, then you might say, it's been a net negative. But you have to look beyond the 100 days.
Crystal ball out, what are you looking at?
I still think it's going to be positive. Now, the positive, actually, if you want to look at the positive in the first 100 days, has driven down the price of oil. And given that oil has traditionally been the single biggest cost element of the airline industry, you'd say, well, that's a positive. And, if you had said to me 6 months ago, you're going to see $60 oil, we'd all be going, whippy, this is great. So that has to be a positive. What's behind the $60 oil, I think, is what you need to look into. But $60 oil will have a positive impact on the industry, and we are seeing people benefit. So I suppose that might set off some of the negatives, and maybe we're at net neutral.
Regular listeners to the show know we keep a very keen eye on the oil price here at the Airline Weekly Lounge. With prices hovering around the $60 a barrel mark, I asked Willie if cheap oil was masking less positive industry metrics, such as lower yields.
The one thing you have to say about lower oil prices is lower oil prices always go with lower yields. There's almost a direct correlation between the oil price and yields. Ticket prices move with the oil price. So if the oil price went up to $120, ticket price will go up. The question has always been what's the pace of change in ticket prices? The oil price is almost overnight. It takes airlines a bit of time to adjust their pricing. So I think the lower oil price actually enables airlines to offer lower prices in the market. So if there's a question of demand being impacted, you still have a situation where airlines can stimulate demand through pricing action. And the positive for the industry is it's stimulating through price when price is at a higher point. So I would see low oil prices being a net positive for the industry.
Given his enormous experience in the industry, I then tried to leverage Willie's 4-decade-plus tenure and asked him the big question: where will oil prices go next?
My guess is that I don't know, and therefore I would hedge. Now not every airline hedges,
but hedging's become quite unfashionable.
Yeah, for a lot of airlines it has, but for For others, it remains a key tool. And it's not because you're speculating on what the oil price will be, is that you're able to eliminate some of the uncertainty, the volatility. So, if you can hedge at $60 Brent, given that you're going into this year, you probably would have budgeted at $80 or $90. I think it would make sense to hedge. Now, even if the price of oil went to $40, I still think that would make sense. When I was at IAG and BA before that, and indeed Aer Lingus, we almost had a mechanical policy towards hedging. We would always hedge within, we had a range. There are airlines who say, I don't need to do that. Over time, you don't make or lose, yeah. And some airlines have clearly benefited significantly from that hedging. But, given that there is just complete uncertainty, will the price of oil stay at 60? I doubt it. If I was to guess, I would guess that it's going to be higher than 60. But, who knows?
Next, I wanted to tap into Willie's time heading up IAG, easily one of the world's largest transatlantic operators. With plenty of industry chatter around softening demand on the North Atlantic, what is his assessment of the current state of play?
I don't think there's any huge uncertainty around the North Atlantic. And I think you've got to look at particular markets. Like Ireland, US is predominantly a leisure market, and it's US point of sale, and doesn't appear to be anything that would suggest that US originating passengers are going to avoid going to places like Ireland. Same to the UK. I think they're still going to travel. US outbound, yeah. Now, question around the US economy, but I think some of the figures, like the first quarter GDP decline in the US was largely, if not solely, down to the level of imports, which was driven by the tariff issue with people front-loading deliveries into the US. So, I think unemployment levels in the US still very low. The US is predominantly a service economy. So, I think you've got to be a bit more nuanced around what's likely to happen. So, the figure that I gave there earlier, Europe to North America and vice versa, in RPK terms being down 1% in March versus last year. If you were to read the headlines in the newspapers, you'd think 5, 10, maybe 15%. And as I said, for me, I always took March and April together because of the timing in Easter. It can significantly disrupt travel patterns around that time. So I wouldn't be overly concerned. What airlines always have is the option to move capacity from one market to another. Airlines like IAG have had to trim their network because of aircraft issues. So they've, in effect, been forced to withdraw from markets that if they had the aircraft, they wouldn't have. So it's not as if there's no markets, no wiggle room. I think there's quite a lot of wiggle room because they can just re-enter some of the markets that they've had to cut capacity on because they didn't have the aircraft. They would now have aircraft available. So, I wouldn't be concerned about it.
You're listening to a special episode of the Airline Weekly Lounge. Don't go anywhere. We'll be back with more insights from Willie Walsh in part 2, including his thoughts on the ATC situation in the United States, the viability of sustainability targets, and what might happen when Russian airspace reopens. Attention all passengers. Do you want a front row seat for the future of air travel? The Skift Idea Awards are back, and the Airlines and Airports category is where innovation takes flight. From next-gen passenger experiences to bold sustainability moves, we're celebrating the ideas transforming the future of aviation. Airline Weekly Lounge listeners get 50% off their first entry with the code AW50FORYOU. That's AW50FORYOU. Head to live.skift.com to start your submission today. Hello and welcome back to the Airline Weekly Lounge. I'm Gordon Smith. This week we're bringing you highlights from a recent one-on-one interview with IATA DG, Willie Walsh. We'll open this second half with Willie's insights on proposed improvements to the air traffic control system in the United States.
Well, I think this is something that the industry would see as a positive with the Trump administration tackling the issue of ATC and ATC staffing in particular. It's gone on too long where we've been operating with insufficient numbers, and that became clear in a number of airports. So, I think the medium to long term has to look much more positive. Short term, it's going to take time to resolve that. But, obviously what happened in Newark, is not welcomed by anybody in the industry. Safety always has to take priority. If controllers weren't feeling in a position to continue to operate, I think you have to acknowledge that and reflect on that. But, those issues would not have come to the fore had proper staffing levels been in place. I think there is an opportunity for it to be more efficient. I think we've got to get the staffing levels right. I think we've got to use all of the technology that's available to us. It's a different environment we're operating in today. We highlight Europe all the time, what it would mean there, but the US is in a similar position. One of the biggest problems we've faced in the US is inadequate manpower, which has restricted the use of airspace and the capacity at airports. And that's clearly something we don't want to see. So I think a commitment to a fundamental review and restructuring of the ATC environment in the US, it has to be welcomed by the industry. And, I think it will embrace both, manning levels, staffing levels, and it will look at technology. The only question we have is how long is it going to take to see improvements in this situation? But we need to see it improved.
Next up, it's that often thorny issue of sustainability. With criticism of interim checkpoint targets from some industry stakeholders, I asked Willie for his perspective on accountable goals leading towards net zero by 2050.
If you're going to have checkpoints, they have to be pragmatic, they have to be realistic, and that's the problem. You can't go, we'll say that 2025, 5%. Why 5%? What was the basis behind 5%? How did you construct a plan that would have the industry at 5% in 2030? And what I'm saying is there was no plan. It was just a number. So they're just picking numbers. There's nothing behind those numbers. And that's my criticism. If you want to set targets, then base your targets on, what's your starting point? What are all the levers that are available? And start, adding up what is possible in that. And the problem there is when we looked at it, the 2030 benchmark, a realistic 2030 benchmark was probably somewhere in the order of 2%. And people would have said, oh, sure, that's completely ridiculous. That's too level. That's lacking in ambition. But it reflects the starting point and where you can actually make progress in that period of time. And it's not going to be linear. That's the point that I keep saying. It's not a linear progression to net zero in 2050. We know that the technology, aircraft technology was always going to take time. And new aircraft are typically 25% more efficient than the aircraft that they would replace. And we're not getting those new aircraft at the pace that we had originally expected. We know it's going to take time to ramp up SAF production. And that's why I'm saying, if you want to set interim targets, set realistic targets that you can justify based on all of the levers that are likely to be pulled in that period. The lack of progress, particularly in relation to the production of SAF, demonstrates that this will only happen, because I've said this right at the beginning, it's not going to be done by airlines alone. So the idea that, it's airlines so the OEMs are not delivering to the commitments that they made. So everybody is out there saying, we're committed to net zero in 2050. But all of the players, other than the airline community, are actually walking away from tangible action that would demonstrate that they're committed. Fuel companies, OEMs, ANSPs, airports, we're not seeing what we would expect from them. And it's not acceptable that, people say, well, what are the airlines going to do about it? It's not the airlines' problem. It's everybody's problem, including governments. As I said, we didn't get a transition to significant volumes of renewable energy because, consumers decided that they were going to do it, or the power suppliers decided they were going to do it. It came about because there was a coordinated approach by governments to facilitate and encourage the production of renewable energy through wind and solar. And we're benefiting from that today. And we need the same approach to aviation. And maybe the mistake we made about talking about sustainable aviation fuel was to we should remind people it's not just sustainable fuel for aviation, it's sustainable fuel for all modes of transport and other industries. The fuel that will be produced by a refinery making sustainable aviation fuel will also produce sustainable fuel for road transport. And, today it's still the case that, aviation is a small part of the transport emissions when you look at total transport emissions, never mind other industries. We know we're about 2.5% of global man-made CO2. But road transport continues to be way in excess of aviation. And, people assume, we'll all be driving around in electric cars. We're not. In 2050, there'll still be billions of internal combustion engine road transport vehicles on the road that will require a sustainable fuel. So I think some people said, you guys, this is all about you want a special deal. We don't. We want to see a significant increase in the production of sustainable fuels and recognising that the options for decarbonising aviation is very limited. We want to see our fair share of that coming to aviation. And, governments will need to recognise that they have a role to play in that and an opportunity. It's not just, producing a sustainable fuel through all of the various feedstocks that we have. It's a massive opportunity for governments, so you don't have to rely on importing fuel from those that have been fortunate enough to have oil in the ground.
Another huge topic for the industry is the ongoing war in Ukraine and the impact on airspace for commercial flights. Here's Willie's take on how things might play out if, or hopefully when, Russian airspace reopens to all carriers.
Yeah, well, you have to be optimistic that we'll see peace in Ukraine, and that the war would end. And I think it's clearly been disappointing that it's gone on, and the tragic nature of that war is terrible. If we see peace and Russian airspace is open to all carriers, I think there's a number of airlines that will be able to move quickly. The supply chain issues are the one that would impact on some. What I pointed out is every airline would need to undertake its own risk assessment. But one of the things you'd need to consider is if you're flying through Russian airspace and you have to divert into a Russian airport where there are no spare parts available, what are you going to do? So it's not just about the airspace reopening. I think there's a lot of other things you'd need to think about. But I think the industry would move quickly.
Of course, it isn't just Russia and Ukraine. Recent flare-ups between India and Pakistan have illustrated again the fragility of the airspace ecosystem in many parts of the world, but particularly in and around the Middle East. As a former pilot himself, I asked Willie if the current global airspace situation was the worst it's ever been.
It is the worst it's ever been. We've had to deal with this for years, and you see shifting traffic flows depending on what part of the airspace is now closed to operations, and it's been, I think, again, a positive for the industry that we're able to adapt quickly to that changing environment. But yeah, it's much more difficult today than it was 20 years ago, and it seems to be only getting more difficult rather than less difficult. But I suppose the positive is, we're now used to reevaluating other opportunities, and some of this it's driven by economics. It's not that the airspace isn't available. It's that it's more economical to fly through certain airspace than to fly through other parts of it. And then this changes on a regular basis. But I think the fact that the industry quickly adapts is important, and no doubt we'll continue to do that. But yeah, much more challenging.
I ended our conversation by asking how appropriate it is that many decisions taken around airspace are made by the individual airline and not national governments or global regulators. Here's what Willie had to say.
The risk isn't the same for every airline. The risk can depend on the aircraft you're operating. That can be a big factor in it. The risk can depend on wider geopolitical issues. The risk can depend on the experience of your crew. The risk can depend on other opportunities that you have. So it's absolutely appropriate that it be done on an individual basis. If, for example, government said, airspace is open to everybody, off you go, I would still expect individual airlines to conduct a risk assessment to satisfy themselves as to whether it was appropriate. Russian airspace is a good example of that. There may be airlines who would decide, actually, I've done my risk assessment and I'm not going to use that airspace. So, for me, it's absolutely appropriate. You leave it to the experts. Airlines are experts in dealing with this issue. The critical issue is make sure that airlines have all of the information that's available, that information is not being withheld from them when they're conducting their risk assessment.
And that brings us to the end of this very special episode of the Airline Weekly Lounge. My thanks to Willie Walsh for being so generous with his time. And a quick reminder that the IATA annual general meeting is taking place in Delhi in India from June 1st through 3rd. Our Skift and Airline Weekly team will be at the event, so look out for insights, analysis and reports on skift.com and in the Airline Weekly issue. If you're not already a subscriber, visit airlineweekly.com/subscribe for more information and to sign up. But in the meantime, wherever you are in the world, thanks for listening, and we'll catch you next time. Whether you're listening to us on Spotify, Apple, or wherever you get your podcasts, please make sure to subscribe, rate us 5 stars, or leave us a positive review. This really helps us get the word out about the Airline Weekly Lounge, so we can continue to bring you this podcast every week, absolutely free of charge. And if you're watching us on YouTube, make sure to subscribe to the Skift channel and hit the notification bell to find out whenever a new video drops.